Henry Carter, a 93-year-old WWII Navy veteran, began his day just as he had for decades. In the quiet town of Maple Grove, the early morning light cast golden hues across the well-manicured lawns and neat homes. It was a community that prided itself on its peace and simplicity, qualities Henry had fought for so many years ago. Each day, Henry woke at dawn, his steps deliberate but steady as he made his way to the sturdy flagpole planted in his front yard. The pole, worn smooth from years of use, stood tall and unwavering, much like the man himself. In his hands, he carried the neatly folded American flag, its edges crisp and perfectly aligned. The flag was more than just fabric to Henry. It was a symbol of the sacrifices he and countless others had made. As he reached the pole, Henry paused, his weathered hands gripping the rope. His sharp blue eyes scanned the horizon as memories flooded his mind, moments from the Pacific Theater where the crack of gunfire and the roar of battleships had shaped him forever. He could still hear the voices of his comrades, young men who had laughed, dreamed, and ultimately given everything for the cause of freedom. "I'll raise it for you," Henry murmured, his voice steady but soft. He drew a deep breath and began to hoist the flag, the rope sliding smoothly through his practiced hands. With each pull, the flag climbed higher, catching the morning breeze until it unfurled fully, its stars and stripes proudly dancing against the sky. For a moment, everything felt right. The neighborhood was still. Birds chirped softly, and the distant hum of the world waking up filled the air. But as Henry stepped back to admire the flag, a faint sound broke through the tranquility. It started as a low rumble, barely noticeable at first. Henry paused, his hand instinctively gripping the rope tighter. The sound grew louder, closer, until it became unmistakable. Motorcycles. The noise was alien to Maple Grove, where the most excitement typically came from a bustling farmer's market or children playing in the park. Henry's brows furrowed as the guttural roar echoed down the quiet street. He turned toward the sound, his sharp instincts from years in service kicking in. From his vantage point on the porch, Henry saw the first motorcycle emerge from the bend at the edge of the neighborhood, then another, and another. The machines gleamed in the sunlight, their riders clad in leather jackets and dark helmets. Even from a distance, Henry could feel the energy shift. This wasn't a casual group passing through. It was something else entirely. As the rumble of engines grew louder, Henry stood his ground, his hand steady on the flagpole. Decades of courage and resilience anchored him. Yet, a pang of unease settled in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his time overseas. The neighborhood was still, but it was no longer the calm stillness Henry knew and loved. This was the kind of silence that came before a storm. As the motorcycles drew nearer, their noise dominating the once quiet street, Henry's gaze didn't waver. He straightened his back, his stature as tall as it had been in his Navy days, and watched. What would you do in Henry's shoes? Would you stand firm, like Henry, or look for help? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage and resilience. Let's discuss together how ordinary people can find extraordinary strength in challenging times. The steady hum of Maple Grove's peaceful life shattered as the first motorcycle roared down Main Street. The sound bounced off the homes and echoed through the neighborhood, pulling curious gazes from behind curtains and causing heads to turn in surprise. Leading the pack was a man who exuded authority and danger. Reed "Snake" Wilson, the gang's leader, was a hulking figure clad in a leather jacket emblazoned with a crimson cobra. His bald head and piercing eyes made him instantly recognizable, and the tattoo of a snake coiling up his neck only added to his menacing appearance. Behind Snake came a procession of motorcycles, each more imposing than the last. The riders wore matching jackets, their expressions a mix of arrogance and aggression. The gang pulled up to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Maple Grove, a dilapidated structure that had stood empty for years. It was once the home of a furniture manufacturer but had since become an eyesore, its windows boarded and graffiti scrawled across its walls. The Crimson Riders claimed the warehouse with swift efficiency. Snake barked orders, his voice carrying over the rumble of idling engines. Some gang members began breaking chains on the warehouse's front gate, while others unloaded makeshift furniture from a rusted truck. Within minutes, the space transformed into their domain. A crimson banner bearing the gang's signature cobra was hung above the entrance, flapping ominously in the wind. The gang's arrival sent shockwaves through the community. Maple Grove had always been a place where neighbors waved at one another. Children played freely in the streets, and the loudest sound came from the church bell on Sunday morning. But now, the gang's roaring engines and raucous laughter disrupted the very essence of the town's serenity. From their windows, residents watched uneasily as the gang settled in. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived 2 houses down from Henry, clutched her grocery bags a little tighter as she hurried inside. Across the street, Mr. Bradley, a retired school teacher, peered through his blinds before closing them entirely. The once bustling neighborhood became eerily quiet, its residents retreating into their homes. Henry Carter observed it all from his porch. Standing beside his flagpole, he watched as the gang made themselves at home. His sharp eyes took in every detail, the reckless way they tossed beer bottles onto the street, the graffiti that now adorned the warehouse walls, and the sheer audacity of their presence. Snake, sensing eyes on him, turned and met Henry's gaze. For a moment their stares locked, an unspoken challenge. But Snake smirked, dismissively revving his engine before turning away. Henry didn't flinch. His face remained stoic, but deep down he felt a stirring of unease. The Crimson Riders had arrived, and Maple Grove would never be the same. In the days following the gang's arrival, the atmosphere in Maple Grove shifted drastically. What was once a lively and welcoming neighborhood became subdued and tense. The laughter of children, a familiar backdrop to the mornings, was gone. Instead, parents kept their little ones indoors, worried glances exchanged between neighbors who avoided lingering outside for too long. Curtains that were once drawn back to let in the sunlight now stayed firmly closed. Mrs. Rodriguez, known for her morning chats with Henry, rushed past his house without stopping, her head low and her eyes avoiding the warehouse entirely. The neighborhood's heartbeat, the connection between its residents, had slowed to an anxious murmur. The gang's presence loomed large, both physically and emotionally. Their motorcycles, parked haphazardly along the street, were a constant reminder of their dominance. At night, music blared from the warehouse, its bass reverberating through the walls of nearby homes. Beer bottles and trash littered the sidewalks by morning, remnants of the gang's revelry. One afternoon, Henry watched as a gang member rode his motorcycle onto a neighbor's lawn, leaving deep tire tracks in the carefully tended grass. The rider laughed as he revved his engine, ignoring the elderly homeowner who stood on the porch, too frightened to say anything. Henry's fists clenched as he witnessed the scene. He had spent his life standing up to bullies, both on the battlefield and at home, and seeing his neighbors cower filled him with both anger and determination. Despite the growing tension, Henry refused to change his routine. Every morning, he stepped outside to raise the flag, his actions deliberate and steadfast. From his porch, he kept a watchful eye on the gang, his quiet presence a stark contrast to their loud and chaotic energy. The gang noticed Henry's unwavering demeanor. Snake in particular seemed both amused and irritated by the old man's resilience. One evening, as Henry tended to his garden, Snake strolled up to the edge of his property, a smug grin on his face. "Nice flowers, old-timer," Snake said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Be a shame if something happened to them." Henry straightened, meeting Snake's gaze with calm resolve. "They've survived worse than you," he replied evenly. Snake's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, turning back to his gang with a dismissive laugh. "We'll see about that," he said, loud enough for Henry to hear. As the gang's dominance grew, the neighborhood seemed to shrink into itself. Fear hung heavy in the air, but Henry's quiet observation and steady resolve stood as a beacon of resistance. Deep down, he knew that standing firm in the face of fire, intimidation was only the first step in a battle that was far from over. The Crimson Riders' harassment of Maple Grove escalated swiftly, with Henry Carter becoming a primary target of their antics. One morning, Henry stepped out onto his porch to find his beloved garden in ruins. The roses he had planted with his late wife Eleanor decades ago were trampled, their petals scattered across the soil. Deep tire tracks marred the once pristine lawn, a stark reminder of the gang's disrespect. Henry knelt beside the damaged flower beds, his weathered hands gently brushing over the broken stems. The sight of his garden, something he had nurtured so lovingly, left him with a mix of sorrow and quiet anger. "Looks like your green thumb's losing its touch, old man," a voice jeered from across the street. Henry glanced up to see Reed, Snake, Wilson leaning casually against his motorcycle, a smug grin plastered on his face. His gang laughed as Snake revved his engine loudly, the noise cutting through the morning quiet like a knife. The harassment didn't stop there. Every evening, the gang blared their music louder, the bass shaking the windows of Henry's home. On one occasion, they rode their motorcycles in circles around his house, their engines roaring as they shouted insults and laughed. Even Henry's sacred flag-raising ritual became a point of mockery. One morning, as he hoisted the stars and stripes, a gang member shouted, "Hey, Grandpa, think that flag's gonna scare us off?" Laughter followed, but Henry kept his focus on the flag, letting it fly high and proud. Despite his unshaken demeanor, Henry couldn't help but notice the growing fear among his neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had always been a warm and friendly presence, now seemed a shadow of her former self. One afternoon, as Henry repaired his mailbox, smashed during the night, Mrs. Rodriguez hesitated at the edge of his property. "I brought some tamales for you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Maria," Henry replied, standing to take the Tupperware. Her eyes darted nervously toward the warehouse, where gang members lounged outside. I wish I could do more," she admitted, barely above a whisper. Henry gave her a reassuring smile. "You've done plenty just by being here," he said gently, though he could see the guilt in her eyes as she hurried back to her house. Emily, the young girl from next door, had stopped riding her bike along the street, something Henry had always enjoyed watching. One day, he saw her peek out from behind her curtains, her wide eyes filled with both curiosity and fear. It pained him to see the joy and freedom of the neighborhood stripped away, replaced by silence and apprehension. The gang's taunts grew bolder as the days passed, but Henry's resolve remained unbroken. Yet beneath his calm exterior, a storm was brewing. As Henry sat on his porch one evening, the setting sun casting an amber glow over Maple Grove, his thoughts drifted back to a time when standing firm wasn't a choice but a necessity. His mind replayed memories of his days in the Pacific during World War II. He could still hear the deafening roar of the battleships, feel the salt spray of the ocean on his face, and remember the faces of his comrades, many of whom had made the ultimate sacrifice. In one memory, he stood on the deck of his ship as enemy planes strafed the water around them. Despite the chaos, he had remained steady, focused on his duty. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," his commanding officer had once told him. It's doing what needs to be done despite it. Those words echoed in his mind now as he faced a different kind of battle. While the enemy wasn't firing bullets, they were tearing at the very fabric of his community, threatening the peace he had fought so hard to preserve. Henry's frustration grew as the gang's antics escalated. One morning, he found graffiti scrawled across his garage door, a crude depiction of a snake alongside mocking words. He spent hours scrubbing it away, each stroke of the brush fueled by his determination not to let them win. As the neighborhood around him withdrew in fear, Henry felt a deeper sense of duty. He couldn't stand idly by while the Crimson Riders dismantled the spirit of Maple Grove. His home wasn't just a house. It was a testament to everything he and Eleanor had built together, a sanctuary of love, respect, and resilience. One evening, as he sat in his living room, the soft light of a single lamp illuminating the room, Henry stared at the photo of Eleanor on the mantel. Her warm smile seemed to whisper encouragement, reminding him of the strength they had always drawn from each other. "They think they can scare us," he murmured aloud, his voice steady. "But they don't know what real strength looks like." The sound of motorcycles roaring outside brought him back to the present. He stood, his posture straight despite his aching knees, and walked to the window. Peering out into the darkness, he watched as the gang loitered outside, their laughter echoing through the night. Henry's frustration was reaching its peak, but so was his resolve. He wasn't just standing for himself. He was standing for his neighbors, for the values he had spent a lifetime upholding. Deep down, he knew that the time to act was drawing near, and when that moment came, he would be ready. It happened on a night when the air was still and heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Henry Carter sat by the window, his eyes scanning the street as he kept his silent vigil. The roar of the Crimson Riders' motorcycles had become as familiar as the sound of the wind, but tonight it felt louder, more menacing. Then he saw them. A group of gang members gathered near his flagpole, their voices carrying over the quiet night. Reed "Snake" Wilson stood at the center, his leather jacket gleaming under the streetlights. With a cruel grin, he nodded toward the flag that Henry had raised earlier that morning. "Let's see what this means to him," Snake sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Henry's heart raced as one of the bikers approached the flagpole. The young man yanked at the rope, pulling it down with little care. The stars and stripes fluttered to the ground, its fabric catching the faint glow of the streetlights. Henry's breath caught as he watched the gang stomp on the flag, grinding their boots into the sacred fabric. The gang laughed, their voices a mix of jeers and taunts. Snake picked up the crumpled flag and waved it mockingly. "This is your pride, old man?" he shouted toward Henry's house. "Doesn't look so tough now." Henry's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the windowsill, his whole body trembling. It wasn't fear that made him shake. It was fury. Decades of memories flooded his mind. The men he had served with, the friends he had buried, and the principles he had fought to protect. The flag wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was a symbol of everything he held sacred. The gang tied the flag to the back of one of their motorcycles. With a deafening roar, the rider sped off, dragging the flag along the pavement. Henry's heart sank as he saw the flag that had once flown proudly now reduced to a soiled and tattered remnant. For the first time in years, Henry felt something he hadn't felt since the war. Helplessness. He sat down heavily in his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the floor. His mind raced with questions. How had it come to this? Could he continue to endure the gang's terror, knowing that his community was paralyzed by fear? Then, a memory surfaced. His commanding officer during the war, standing tall amid chaos, his voice clear and unwavering. "When the enemy pushes you to the brink, you push back harder." Henry closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His anguish began to transform into resolve. He couldn't allow the gang's disrespect to define the legacy of his home, his community, or the flag he had fought so hard to protect. It was time to act. The next morning, Henry stood in his study staring at the worn leather wallet on his desk. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he opened it, revealing a faded military contact card he had carried for decades. The edges were frayed and the ink was faint, but the phone number scrawled on the back was still legible. Henry's hands steadied as he picked up the phone. His heart pounded in his chest as he dialed the number, the sound of each button pressing like a drumbeat of purpose. The line clicked, and a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Veterans Motorcycle Alliance. How can we assist?" Henry straightened, his posture, his voice firm and clear. "This is Henry Carter, Pacific Theater 1942 to 1945. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. "Henry Carter, sir, it's an honor to speak with you. What's the situation?" Henry explained, his tone unwavering. "There's a gang in Maple Grove. They've taken over the old warehouse, terrorized the neighborhood, and defiled my flag. I've tried to stand against them, but I need backup." The man on the other end, whose name was Jack, spoke with quiet respect. "Sir, you don't have to explain. We've got your back. Where are you located?" Henry gave his address, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of his gratitude. "No need to thank us, Mr. Carter," Jack replied. "You stood for us once. Now it's our turn to stand for you. We'll be there soon." Henry hung up the phone and exhaled deeply. A sense of relief washed over him, though the tension in his chest remained. He glanced out the window at his battered flagpole, a pang of sorrow still lingering in his heart. But for the first time in weeks, he felt hope, a hope forged not from words, but from the promise of action. As the hours passed, Henry prepared himself for what lay ahead. He straightened his Navy portrait on the wall, his reflection catching in the glass. His uniform, long since retired, was a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. "When the enemy pushes you to the brink," he murmured to himself, "you push back harder." The sound of distant engines began to grow louder, a deep and steady rumble that filled the air. Henry stepped onto his porch, his cane in hand, and watched the horizon. The veterans were coming. The sound began as a low rumble on the horizon, like a distant thunderstorm rolling toward Maple Grove. Henry Carter stood on his porch, the morning sun glinting off his weathered flagpole. He tightened his grip on his cane as the unmistakable growl of motorcycles grew louder and steadier. This wasn't the chaotic roar of the Crimson Riders. This sound carried precision and purpose. Around the corner came the first riders, their Harley-Davidsons gleaming in the sunlight. One after another they appeared, forming a disciplined column that stretched down the street. The veterans moved, as if they were still on the battlefield, organized, confident, and united. Leading the convoy was Major Caroline Hayes, a tall woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back into a braid. Her leather jacket bore patches from her service in Desert Storm, alongside the insignia of the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance. Her posture was straight, her expression calm but commanding. As the convoy came to a halt in front of Henry's house, Major Hayes dismounted with practiced ease. Her boots clicked against the pavement as she approached Henry, snapping a crisp salute. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady. "Major Caroline Hayes, Veterans Motorcycle Alliance. We're here to assist." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. Behind Hayes, over 50 veterans dismounted their bikes in unison. A sea of leather jackets adorned with military patches, unit insignias, and American flags. The riders ranged in age, from Vietnam-era soldiers with silver hair to younger veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. Some carried the visible scars of their service, prosthetic limbs, canes, but all moved with a shared sense of purpose. The veterans formed a loose perimeter around Henry's property, their presence radiating quiet strength. They didn't yell or posture. Their very demeanor was enough to command respect. Meanwhile, across the street, the Crimson Riders began to emerge from the warehouse. Reed "Snake" Wilson appeared first, his swagger more pronounced than ever as he lit a cigarette, and surveyed the newcomers. But the confidence in his step faltered slightly as more veterans continued to arrive, their numbers quickly outmatching his gang. Snake called out to his crew, who gathered behind him, their bravado masking their unease. "What's this? A retirement? Home field trip?" he sneered, his voice carrying just enough edge to mask the crack in his confidence. Major Hayes didn't flinch. She turned to Henry with a calm smile. "Mr. Carter, if you don't mind, we'll be having a conversation with these gentlemen." Henry nodded, stepping back toward his porch. "By all means, Major." The veterans moved as one, their bikes forming a deliberate line across the street. Their discipline and unity were in stark contrast to the Crimson Riders, whose disorganized movements and nervous glances betrayed their unease. The atmosphere grew thick with tension as the veterans approached the warehouse. Major Hayes led the way, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. The Crimson Riders huddled together, their earlier bravado now replaced by whispered conversations and shifting feet. "Who's in charge here?" Hayes called out, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Snake stepped forward, his leather jacket creaking as he adjusted it. "That'd be me," he said, his smirk returning. "Reed Wilson, but folks around here call me Snake." Hayes stopped a few paces away, her arms crossed over her chest. "Well, Snake," she said, her tone even, "this isn't your neighborhood to run. That ends today." Snake chuckled, though it lacked conviction. "You think a bunch of old-timers can just roll in here and tell us what to do?" One of the veterans, a broad-shouldered Marine with a prosthetic leg, stepped forward. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "We're not here to argue. You've terrorized this community long enough. Pack your things and leave, or we'll make sure you're dealt with properly." Snake's smirk faltered, and he glanced over his shoulder at his gang. His crew, once loud and confident, now avoided his gaze. The presence of the veterans was having an undeniable effect. These were not people who could be intimidated. "You've got no right," Snake said, his voice rising in desperation. "This warehouse is ours now." Hayes took a step closer, her eyes locking onto Snake's. "This warehouse belongs to a Marine Corps veteran who's more than willing to press charges for trespassing. And I've got a folder full of evidence, vandalism, theft, harassment, that the police will be very interested in. Care to add resisting arrest to the list?" Snake's bravado crumbled further as Hayes's words hit home. The gang's disorganization became more apparent as some members started edging toward their bikes, clearly ready to leave. "What's it gonna be, Snake?" Hayes asked, her tone sharp. "You can walk out of here now, or we can make a few calls and have this place surrounded by police in 10 minutes. Snake glanced back at his crew, hoping for support, but found none. Even his second-in-command, Hammer, avoided his gaze. The gang's unity had dissolved in the face of the veterans' disciplined strength. One of the younger gang members broke the silence. "Maybe we should go, Snake. This isn't worth it." Snake clenched his jaw, his shoulders sagging slightly as he realized he was out of options. "Fine," he spat. "We'll go. But this ain't over." Hayes didn't react to the threat. Instead, she motioned to the veterans behind her. "Start cleaning up. We're not leaving this place a mess for the neighbors." Under the watchful eyes of the veterans, the gang reluctantly began picking up trash, scrubbing graffiti off walls, and collecting their belongings from the warehouse. The once boisterous Crimson Riders worked in silence, their tough guy act thoroughly dismantled. Henry watched from his porch, his chest swelling with pride. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. As the veterans continued their work, Major Hayes approached Henry with a small smile. "We're just getting started," she said. "This community deserves better." Henry nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you, Major, for everything." The faintest smile tugged at Hayes's lips as she turned back toward the warehouse, the sound of the veterans' quiet efficiency filling the air. The air around the warehouse was thick with tension as the veterans completed their circle. There, polished motorcycles and disciplined formation stood in stark contrast to the chaotic cluster of the Crimson Riders' bikes scattered across the lot. Major Caroline Hayes stepped forward, her boots clicking sharply against the pavement. Her commanding presence cut through the uneasy murmurs of Snake's crew. Reed "Snake" Wilson sauntered out of the warehouse, attempting to mask his unease with bravado. His leather vest, emblazoned with the gang's crimson serpent emblem, seemed dull compared to the clean lines and polished patches of the veterans surrounding him. He was tall, with a snake tattoo winding up his neck, but his swagger faltered under the weight of the veterans' silent stares. Well, Snake drawled, his voice carrying a forced confidence. "Looks like the cavalry's here. What do you think you're going to do, march in and take over?" Major Hayes stopped a few feet from him, her piercing gaze unwavering. "We're here to ensure this neighborhood feels safe again," she said, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. Snake sneered. "Safe? You've got no right to come onto my turf and tell me what's what." Hayes smirked, pulling a slim folder from her saddlebag. She flipped it open, revealing documents and photos. "Your turf? That's interesting, Snake, or should I say, Reed Wilson?" Snake's sneer faltered as she held up a mugshot. It was his, taken years ago. Gasps rippled through his crew as the veterans' disciplined stance only seemed to tighten around them. Major Hayes continued, her voice steady and firm. "Reed Wilson, wanted in 2 states for aggravated assault, drug trafficking, and possession of stolen property. Shall I keep going?" Snake's crew shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other with uncertainty. Snake, for all his posturing, looked rattled. "That's a load of bull," he barked, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Hayes raised an eyebrow, pulling out another document. "Oh, really? Because these are arrest warrants from Nevada and Arizona. And let's not forget the evidence of extortion and vandalism right here in Maple Grove." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You've been running scared, Snake. Hiding behind these boys in this abandoned warehouse thinking no one would notice." One of Snake's lieutenants, a wiry man known as Hammer, took a hesitant step forward. "Is this true, Snake?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Snake shot him a glare. "Shut it, Hammer. They're just trying to mess with us." Hayes ignored the exchange, turning to address the entire gang. "Do you think your leader's been honest with you? Do you think he's looking out for your best interests?" She gestured toward the veterans behind her. "These men and women know the value of trust, loyalty, and honor. Can you say the same about the person leading you?" The gang's cohesion began to crack. Some members shifted nervously, while others avoided Snake's gaze altogether. Hammer spoke again, louder this time. "You told us we'd be safe here, Snake, that nobody could touch us, but it looks like you've been lying to us." "Enough," Snake snapped, his temper flaring. "You think they're here to help you? They're just a bunch of old-timers, trying to relive their glory days." Major Hayes took a step closer, her calm demeanor unshaken. "And yet these old-timers are the ones who've built lives of honor and integrity while you've been running from the law. You're not untouchable, Snake. In fact, you're more vulnerable than you've ever been." She nodded toward one of the veterans, who stepped forward holding a laptop. The screen displayed live footage from security cameras installed around the neighborhood. The gang's vandalism, their harassment of residents, and even Snake's recent tirades were all recorded. Everything you've done here is documented, Hayes said. The police already have copies. It's only a matter of time before they arrive. Snake's jaw tightened, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. His crew, now visibly disillusioned, began to step away from him, as if distancing themselves from his growing downfall. Hammer crossed his arms, his voice firm. You said we'd build something strong, Snake, but all you've done is paint a target on our backs. Snake's facade finally cracked. I did what I had to do to keep us afloat, he spat. None of you would have survived without me. Hayes shook her head. Survived? You've led these men into a dead end, but it's not too late for them to choose a better path. She turned to the remaining gang members. You don't have to follow him into the hole he's dug. There are people here, veterans, neighbors who can help you turn things around. It's your choice. Several gang members exchanged glances, their resolve wavering. One by one, they stepped back from Snake, leaving him standing alone in the center of the lot. You cowards, Snake shouted, his voice echoing in the silence. But his words carried no weight. The gang was no longer his to command. As the sound of police sirens grew louder in the distance, Hayes crossed her arms. This is the end of the line, Snake. You can either walk out of here with dignity, or we'll let the authorities handle it. Snake looked around, realizing he had no allies left. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. You haven't seen the last of me, he muttered, though his words rang hollow. We'll be here, Hayes replied calmly, as Snake was taken into custody by arriving officers. The remaining gang members stood uncertainly. Some approached the veterans, cautiously seeking guidance. Others simply slipped away, too ashamed to face what they'd become. The once menacing gang was now fractured, their leader exposed for the coward he truly was. The neighborhood, silent witnesses to this dramatic confrontation, began to stir with renewed hope. The tide had turned, and the Crimson Riders were no longer in control. The veterans' unwavering strength and Henry's steadfast determination had broken their grip, paving the way for healing and unity in Maple Grove. The aftermath of Snake's downfall brought a shift in the air of Maple Grove. The once quiet neighborhood began to buzz with cautious energy as residents peeked through their curtains, watching the dramatic scene unfold. For the first time in weeks, the ominous presence of the Crimson Riders had been shattered, replaced by the resolute strength of the veterans standing tall. Henry Carter stood on his porch, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he surveyed the scene. The sight of his neighbors slowly emerging from their homes filled him with a sense of hope. It wasn't just the veterans who had arrived to fight for justice. It was the spirit of community that had long been buried under fear. Now resurfacing like a long-lost treasure, Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to step out, her hesitant movements giving way to determination as she approached Henry's yard. Mr. Carter, she called out, her voice steady but emotional. Thank you for standing up for all of us. We've been too scared to act, but you've shown us that we don't have to be afraid anymore. Henry offered her a warm smile. I didn't do it alone, Mrs. Rodriguez. These veterans, these brave men and women, they reminded us all of what it means to stand together. From the corner of the street, young Emily emerged with her father, clutching a small American flag. We brought this for your garden, Mr. Carter, she said softly, handing it to him. Her father nodded, his voice filled with gratitude. You've been an example for all of us, Henry. It's time we help make this neighborhood whole again. One by one, more neighbors ventured outside. Mr. Thompson from 2 doors down rolled up his sleeves and started gathering scattered debris. The Johnson family brought tools and paint, ready to help repair the damage done by the gang. The once silent street came alive with the sounds of collaboration and shared purpose. Under Major Hayes's direction, the remaining members of the Crimson Riders were put to work. Armed with scrub brushes, paint cans, and brooms, they were forced to undo the destruction they had inflicted. "Start with the graffiti," Hayes instructed, her voice firm but measured. "Every wall, every fence, you're going to clean it until this neighborhood looks better than it did before you arrived." The gang members grumbled, but none dared defy her or the silent, watchful presence of the veterans surrounding them. Snake's downfall had left them leaderless and without the bravado they once relied on. Hammer, Snake's second-in-command, scrubbed at the graffiti on Henry's garage door, the harsh red paint slowly giving way to the original white. "This wasn't how things were supposed to go," he muttered under his breath. Henry, standing nearby, watched him with a steady gaze. "It's never too late to make things right," he said. "What matters is the choices you make moving forward." As the hours passed, the neighborhood transformed. The gang cleaned tirelessly under the veterans' supervision, while the residents pitched in wherever they could. Together, they repaired broken fences, replanted uprooted flowers, and swept away the debris of fear and destruction. Mrs. Rodriguez brought out lemonade and sandwiches, handing them out to the volunteers. "You've all done so much for us," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's the least we can do to thank you." Emily worked alongside the veterans, carefully replanting Henry's roses. A younger veteran who introduced himself as Jake knelt beside her, showing her how to properly pack the soil. "You're a natural," he said with a smile, earning a shy grin from the girl. By late afternoon, the gang had finished their labor, their tough facades worn down by hours of hard work. Major Hayes called them to the center of the street, addressing them with the authority of someone who had seen true battles. "You've made a mess of this neighborhood," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "But today, you've taken a step toward accountability. Remember this moment the next time you think about following someone like Snake. You can choose a better path. It's up to you." The gang members nodded, subdued. Some mumbled quiet apologies before leaving the street, their motorcycles roaring to life one by one. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the neighborhood gathered around Henry's flagpole. The veterans had worked tirelessly to repair it, and now it stood tall and gleaming, a symbol of resilience and unity. Major Hayes stepped forward, holding a freshly folded American flag. "Mr. Carter," she said, "would you do the honor?" Henry took the flag, his hands trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment. As he attached it to the pole and raised it skyward, the crowd watched in reverent silence. When the flag unfurled against the golden light of the setting sun, a cheer erupted. "This is what we can achieve when we stand together," Hayes said, addressing the gathered crowd. "Fear loses its power when we face it as a united community." In the days that followed, the spirit of unity only grew stronger. The residents of Maple Grove, once paralyzed by fear, had found their strength in each other. Inspired by Henry and the veterans, they began planning new ways to ensure their neighborhood remained a safe and welcoming place for all. Plans were made to turn the abandoned warehouse into a community center with spaces for workshops, gardening, and neighborhood meetings. Henry's garden became a symbol of resilience, with neighbors stopping by to admire the freshly planted roses and share a kind word with the man who had inspired them all. For Henry, the transformation of Maple Grove was more than just a physical change. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and unity could triumph. As he sat on his porch, watching children play and neighbors chat, he felt a renewed sense of peace, a peace that had been fought for and earned by the collective strength of his community. The morning air in Maple Grove carried a sense of renewal. Neighbors emerged cautiously from their homes, many carrying tools, buckets, and plants. The veterans, led by Major Caroline Hayes, were already gathered at Henry Carter's front yard. Their presence, organized and purposeful, set the tone for the day. It was time to rebuild. Henry stood on his porch, his weathered hand resting on his cane, watching as people of all ages came together. The sight brought a lump to his throat. After weeks of fear and chaos, the energy in the air felt different, hopeful, almost celebratory. "All right, everyone," Major Hayes called out, her voice steady and authoritative. "Let's get to work. Team 1, you're on the garden. Team 2, let's clean up the yard. Team 3, focus on the flagpole. We're going to restore this place piece by piece." The neighbors and veterans sprang into action, each group tackling their assigned task with determination. Henry couldn't help but smile as he saw Mrs. Rodriguez kneeling beside a veteran, replanting one of the roses that had been uprooted by the gang. "This one's for Martha," Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, glancing up at Henry with a warm smile. Henry stepped closer, his voice filled with gratitude. "She'd love that, thank you." In the center of the yard, a retired Army engineer worked on the flagpole, ensuring it would stand tall once again. "This flagpole needs to be more than sturdy," he said, tightening a bolt. "It needs to remind everyone that this community doesn't bow to bullies." Emily, the young girl from next door, was buzzing with excitement. She eagerly handed tools to the adults and helped gather debris from the lawn. "Can I plant a rose?" she asked, her voice full of hope. A veteran nodded and handed her a small spade. "Absolutely, kiddo. These roses are going to need someone to look after them for years to come. Think you're up for the job?" Emily nodded enthusiastically, her hands already digging into the soil. "I'll take care of them, just like Mr. Carter did." The restoration effort was as much about healing as it was about rebuilding. Each rose planted, each broken piece of the yard mended, symbolized a step toward reclaiming their sense of peace and pride. At one point, Henry noticed a young veteran struggling to replant a particularly stubborn rose bush. "You've got to loosen the soil a bit more," Henry said, stepping in to help. The veteran looked up and smiled. "I guess I could use some pointers, sir. Gardening's not exactly part of basic training." Henry chuckled, taking the spade and showing him how it was done. "You've got the strength for it. Now you just need the patience. Roses are a lot like people. They need a little care and a lot of heart." As the day wore on, the yard began to transform. The grass was raked, clean, the flower beds restored, and the vibrant roses brought a touch of life back to the space. By late afternoon, the focus shifted to the flagpole. The entire group gathered as the veterans prepared to raise the newly installed flagpole. Henry stood at the base, the folded American flag in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, not from age but from the overwhelming emotions of the moment. "Would you do the honors, Mr. Carter?" Major Hayes asked, stepping aside. Henry nodded, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It would be my privilege." As Henry attached the flag to the rope, the crowd fell silent. The sound of the fabric unfurling in the breeze was accompanied by a collective sense of pride. Slowly, Henry hoisted the flag, his movements deliberate and reverent. When it reached the top, it caught the wind, standing tall against the evening sky. A cheer erupted from the crowd. Neighbors clapped and whistled and veterans saluted, their expressions a mix of pride and respect. Henry stepped back, looking up at the flagpole with tears streaming down his face. "She's back where she belongs," he said softly, his voice choked with emotion. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her own eyes. "And so are we." As the sun began to set, the yard was finally complete. Rows of roses bloomed in vibrant colors, their petals glistening with dew. Emily ran up to Henry, her hands dirt-streaked, but her face glowing with pride. "Look, Mr. Carter," she said, pointing to a special white rosebush planted at the center of the garden. "This one's for you and Mrs. Martha. We named it the Heart of Maple Grove." Henry knelt beside the bush, his hand brushing against its delicate petals. "Thank you, Emily. You've done something truly special here." The evening ended with the group sharing food and stories, their bonds strengthened by the day's efforts. As Henry sat on his porch, watching the flag sway gently in the breeze, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Thank you all," he said, his voice carrying over the chatter. "You didn't just rebuild my garden, you restored my faith in this community." Major Hayes raised her cup in a toast. "To Henry Carter and the courage that brought us all here." The group raised their glasses, the mood light and hopeful. For the first time in weeks, Maple Grove felt like home again. The sun rose over Maple Grove, casting a warm, golden light across a neighborhood that now felt renewed. Where fear and tension once lingered, there was a palpable sense of hope. The sound of children laughing echoed down the street, a stark contrast to the silence that had gripped the area just weeks before. Henry Carter sat on his front porch, sipping his morning coffee as he watched Emily and a group of neighborhood kids chase each other across freshly mowed lawns. His garden, now a vibrant display of roses and new blooms, stood as a testament to the resilience of the community. Across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez was hanging a banner on her porch that read, "Maple Grove, stronger together." She waved at Henry with a cheerful smile, a sight that had become more common as neighbors began to step outside their homes again. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took weeks of effort, coordination, and, most importantly, courage inspired by Henry. The presence of the veterans had left a lasting impact, not just in their actions, but in the example they set of standing together against adversity. A few days after the veterans helped restore Henry's property, Major Caroline Hayes organized a community meeting at the Maple Grove Elementary School gym. The turnout was remarkable. Families, young and old, filled the room, eager to discuss the future of their neighborhood. Henry, seated in the front row, listened as neighbors shared their gratitude and ideas for moving forward. "We need more than just a cleanup," Mrs. Chen said, her voice firm but warm. "We need to build something lasting, a reminder of what we can achieve when we work together." Major Hayes nodded. "A community thrives when its people take ownership. Let's channel this energy into something meaningful. What do you all envision for Maple Grove?" Ideas began to flow. "Let's organize a block party to celebrate," suggested Mark, a father of 3. "Something that brings everyone together and lets us show appreciation for what we've accomplished." "A neighborhood watch," added Mrs. Rodriguez, "to make sure we never feel that vulnerable again." "And maybe we can turn the old warehouse into something useful," Emily chimed in, "like a community center or a space for kids to play." The crowd murmured in agreement, the enthusiasm spreading like wildfire. Within days, the first steps were underway. Volunteers began organizing committees to address different projects. Mark took charge of planning the block party, while Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Chen led the effort to create a neighborhood watch. Emily, eager to help, started brainstorming ideas for the community center with her friends. Even the kids were involved. They gathered in Henry's garden one afternoon, sketching out colorful designs for what they wanted the community center to look like. "This should be a safe place for everyone," Emily explained to Henry, showing him a drawing of a building surrounded by flowers and a playground. Henry smiled. "That's a wonderful vision, Emily. Keep dreaming big." Meanwhile, Major Hayes worked with local officials to secure the necessary permissions for transforming the warehouse. The building, once a symbol of fear, was quickly becoming the centerpiece of the neighborhood's rebirth. As renovations on the warehouse began, it became clear that this wasn't just a building project, it was a healing process. Veterans who had been part of the earlier effort returned to lend a hand, working alongside the neighbors to clean, repair, and paint. Henry, though not as physically spry as he once was there every day offering advice and encouragement. His presence served as a constant reminder of why this effort mattered. One sunny afternoon, the first wall of the warehouse was painted. The neighbors and veterans worked together to create a mural depicting a young Henry raising the American flag with the words, Courage unites us." When the mural was unveiled, the crowd erupted in applause. Henry stood silently, his hand over his heart, deeply moved by the tribute. The block party became a turning point. The streets of Maple Grove were transformed into a lively celebration, complete with food stalls, games, and music. Families mingled freely, laughter and conversation filling the air. Henry was seated in a place of honor, surrounded by neighbors who now saw him as more than just the quiet man across the street. He was their hero, the catalyst for the change that had brought them all together. As the sun set that evening, Emily approached Henry with a plate of Mrs. Rodriguez's famous tamales. "Mr. Carter, do you think things will stay this way?" she asked, her young eyes filled with curiosity. Henry looked around at the smiling faces and the renewed sense of unity. "I think it will, Emily, as long as we remember that we're stronger together." Months later, the newly opened Maple Grove Community Center became the heart of the neighborhood. Its walls were adorned with photographs and memorabilia from Henry's Navy days, alongside stories of the veterans who had come to their aid. The center offered programs for all ages: gardening workshops, after-school tutoring, fitness classes, and even a flag-raising ceremony every morning. Henry was a regular presence, often found sharing his stories with the children or tending to the roses planted in the center's garden. Emily became the unofficial ambassador of the center, organizing events and helping other kids learn about the importance of community. One quiet evening, Henry sat on his porch, gazing at the neighborhood that had come alive with activity. He could hear laughter coming from the community center and saw neighbors chatting as they walked their dogs. Mrs. Rodriguez joined him, holding 2 cups of tea. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said, handing him a cup. Henry nodded. "It sure is. This place, these people, they're everything Martha and I dreamed of when we moved here." "You've done something incredible, Henry," she added. He shook his head. "We all did. I just reminded everyone of what they were capable of." As the evening turned to night, Henry watched the flag at the community center gently sway in, the breeze illuminated by soft lights. It stood as a symbol of everything they had overcome and everything they could achieve. And as he sat there, surrounded by the love and unity of his community, Henry knew that the legacy of Maple Grove would endure. The old warehouse on the corner of Maple Grove had once loomed as a symbol of fear and chaos. Its broken windows, graffiti-stained walls, and abandoned interiors were a painful reminder of the days when the Crimson Riders had claimed the neighborhood as their own. But now, under the collective efforts of the veterans, neighbors, and local officials, the warehouse had transformed into something entirely different: the Maple Grove Veterans Community Center. The journey to its new purpose had been nothing short of remarkable. What started as a simple idea to reclaim the space and give it back to the community quickly became a project fueled by passion, determination, and the shared vision of creating a place that would inspire unity for generations to come. The first step in the transformation was to clear out the remnants of the past. Volunteers, including many of the veterans who had first arrived to support Henry Carter, joined forces with neighbors to gut the interior. Broken furniture and debris were hauled out, walls were scrubbed clean, and layers of grime were peeled away to reveal the potential beneath. Henry, though limited by his age, insisted on being there every day. He sat outside the warehouse in a folding chair, watching the progress and offering words of encouragement. His presence alone was enough to keep everyone motivated. "We're not just rebuilding a building," Major Caroline Hayes said during one of the early workdays. "We're rebuilding trust, hope, and a sense of belonging. That's what this center will stand for." By the time the renovations were complete, the warehouse was unrecognizable. Its walls were painted in a fresh, vibrant navy blue, accented with white trim. A large mural adorned the front wall, depicting a young Henry raising the American flag, with his shipmates, surrounded by symbols of unity and community. Beneath the mural were the words, "Together we stand." Once the physical transformation was complete, the real magic began, creating programs that would bring people together. Gardening workshops. One of the first programs to launch was inspired by Henry himself. His love for gardening had become well known, and neighbors wanted to honor his passion. The veterans partnered with local gardening clubs to start workshops in the community center's newly landscaped garden. Every Saturday morning, families gathered in the garden to learn about planting, soil care, and sustainable practices. Henry became the unofficial instructor, sharing his decades of knowledge with everyone who wanted to listen. Emily, the young girl from next door, took a special interest in the workshops. "Mr. Carter, can we plant roses like yours?" she asked one morning. "Of course," Henry replied, smiling warmly, "but you have to promise to take care of them. Roses need attention, just like people." Flag-raising ceremonies. Another cornerstone of the community center was the daily flag-raising ceremony. What had once been Henry's solitary ritual now became a shared tradition. Every morning at 7 a.m., neighbors, veterans, and even local officials gathered outside the center to watch the flag rise. The ceremony included a moment of silence to honor fallen heroes and a brief reading of inspirational words. Henry was always at the center of these gatherings, standing tall despite his age. On special occasions, he was invited to share stories from his Navy days, captivating audiences young and old with tales of courage and resilience. "I think about the men I served with every time I see that flag," Henry said during one ceremony. "This is our way of remembering them and making sure their sacrifices weren't in vain." The community center quickly became the heart of Maple Grove. Its doors were always open, welcoming people of all ages and backgrounds. Veterans who had once struggled with isolation found solace in the camaraderie of their peers. Neighbors who barely knew each other began to form lasting friendships. The center offered a wide range of programs, including after-school tutoring. Local teachers and volunteers helped kids with homework and offered mentoring sessions. Fitness classes. Veterans led exercise programs tailored to all age groups, from yoga for seniors to strength training for teens. Cooking nights. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Chen teamed up to host weekly cooking classes, where they shared family recipes and encouraged neighbors to bond over shared meals. One evening, as families gathered for a potluck at the center, Major Hayes took a moment to reflect. "This isn't just a building," she said. "It's a living, breathing symbol of what we can achieve when we stand together." The programs didn't just benefit individuals, they strengthened the entire community. The presence of the center created a sense of safety and stability. Children played freely in the nearby park without fear. Families walked their dogs and greeted each other with smiles. Henry often sat on a bench outside the center, marveling at the life bustling around him. "Martha would have loved this," he said one afternoon, speaking to Emily as she watered the roses. "She would have been so proud of you, Mr. Carter," Emily replied. "We all are." The Maple Grove Veterans Community Center wasn't just a building. It was a testament to what could be accomplished through unity, courage, and determination. It stood as a beacon of hope, reminding everyone who walked through its doors that no challenge was insurmountable when faced together. For Henry, it was more than just a place. It was a legacy. Every program, every flag-raising ceremony, every laugh that echoed through its halls was proof that the spirit of community could overcome even the darkest of days. And as he sat outside, watching neighbors and veterans work, side by side, he knew that Maple Grove's best days were still ahead. The Maple Grove Veterans Community Center had become a symbol of resilience, hope, and community spirit. And at the heart of it all was Henry Carter, a man whose quiet courage and unwavering resolve had inspired an entire neighborhood to come together. One brisk morning, the air was filled with excitement as neighbors and veterans gathered outside the center for a special unveiling. The flagpole stood tall and proud, the freshly polished brass gleaming in the sunlight. Children played nearby, their laughter a joyful reminder of how far the community had come. Major Caroline Hayes stood at the microphone, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. Today we honor not just a building or a project, but the legacy of a man who reminded us all of what it means to stand up for what's right, she said. Henry Carter has shown us that one person's courage can inspire an entire community. She gestured toward the side of the building where a large mural was covered by a white cloth. With a nod, two young veterans pulled the cloth away, revealing the artwork beneath. The mural was breathtaking. It depicted a younger Henry Carter in his Navy uniform, standing at attention with an American flag in the background. Surrounding him were scenes of the neighborhood's transformation. The restored garden, the veterans, convoy and neighbors working side by side. Beneath it all, in bold letters, were the words, "In honor of Henry Carter, a legacy of courage and community." The crowd erupted in applause, and Henry, seated in his folding chair at the front, wiped a tear from his eye. Emily, the young girl who had helped replant Henry's roses, stepped up to the microphone next. She held a small piece of paper, but her hands shook with excitement. "Mr. Carter, you've taught us all so much," she began, her voice trembling. "Not just about roses or flags, but about being brave and standing up for what's right. You showed us that even when things seem scary, we can make them better if we work together." She paused, looking out at the crowd. "This mural is for you, but what you've done for this neighborhood is something we'll carry with us forever." Emily's words brought a wave of emotion over the gathering, and several people were seen dabbing their eyes. As the event wound down, Henry was invited to speak. With the help of his cane, he rose slowly, his figure still commanding respect despite his age. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I never set out to be a hero or to have my face on a wall. I just wanted to protect the place that means so much to me. This neighborhood. It's not just where I live. It's where I've built a life, where I raised my flag every morning, to honor those we've lost, and where I've found a family in all of you." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This center, this mural, it's not just about me. It's about all of us. It's about what we can accomplish when we put fear aside and stand together. Thank you for letting me be a part of this incredible journey." The crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation as Henry returned to his seat, his heart full of gratitude. In the days and weeks that followed, the mural became a centerpiece of the community. Visitors to the center often stopped to admire the artwork, learning the story of Henry Carter and the neighborhood he helped save. Inside the center, a new program was launched in his honor, Henry's Heroes. This initiative focused on mentoring young people, teaching them the values of service, respect, and courage. Veterans, neighbors, and even local leaders volunteered their time, ensuring that the lessons of Henry's life would continue to inspire future generations. One evening, Henry took a quiet walk through the neighborhood. The streets, once filled with fear and chaos, were now alive with the sound of children playing and families chatting on their porches. The sight of the community center brought a warm smile to his face. He stopped by the garden, now bursting with vibrant roses, and ran his fingers gently over the petals. The flagpole stood tall, the stars and stripes waving proudly against the setting sun. As he gazed at the mural, Henry felt a deep sense of peace. The battles he had fought, both long ago on distant shores and more recently in his own backyard, had not been in vain. Turning to Emily, who had joined him in the garden, he said softly, "This is what it's all about, isn't it? Making sure the next generation has something to believe in." Emily nodded, her eyes shining with admiration. "And you've given us plenty to believe in, Mr. Carter." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry made his way back to his porch where he could hear the sounds of laughter and life carrying on around him. He sat down in his favorite chair, content to watch the world he had helped rebuild. With a smile, he looked up at the flag and whispered, "We did good." The mural, the garden, the community center. These were not just symbols of his legacy, but of a neighborhood united by courage and hope. And in every flower that bloomed, and every flag that flew, Henry's spirit lived on. As the sun sets over Maple Grove, we're reminded of the incredible strength and courage of people like Henry Carter. His determination not only protected his beloved community, but also inspired it to unite, heal, and thrive. It's a powerful reminder that no matter our age, we can all make a difference. If Henry's story touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. What stood out to you the most? Was it his unyielding spirit, the veterans' unity, or the transformation of the neighborhood? We'd love to hear your thoughts, and don't forget, every like, comment, and share helps us bring inspiring stories like this to even more people. If you believe in the power of community, resilience, and standing up for what's right, share this video with your friends and family. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of courage and hope. Together, let's celebrate stories that remind us of the good in the world and the strength we all carry within us. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes all it takes is one person standing tall to make the world a better place. See you in the next story.